Okay, well, hello everybody. I hope you're all having a great start to the fall semester. I'm Lisa Reichert. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Career and Professional Development Lead within the People and Organization Development Team, part of UC Berkeley People and Culture. And I want to welcome you to this Now Encore series, which is a follow-on from our 2023 Next Opportunity at Work Now conference, which is our annual professional development event for staff, in which in the Now Encore series, we want to continue to present valuable content from amazing and knowledgeable presenters. And today's Now Encore series workshop is the creative process of decision-making in teams. And in a time where adaptability and creativity are key drivers for organizational effectiveness, understanding and applying this process could be a game changer for teams seeking to thrive and innovate in our complex and fast-paced world. And today's workshop is co-sponsored by the Berkeley Facilitators Network. How many people here heard about this workshop through BFN? Give a thumbs up or put your favorite emoji in the chat. We have a great turnout today. And so I also just want to welcome our co-presenters to BFN members, and they are skilled facilitators and awesome team members. The first co-presenter is Evelyn Thorne. Evelyn is a writer, educator, and facilitator with a focus on how systemic and cultural contexts shape our creative selves. As the Creative Discovery Coordinator and Advisor for UC Berkeley, she serves as liaison between the Berkeley Discovery Hub and Office of Berkeley Arts and Design, fostering student-driven creative discovery across campus. Bringing a background in creative education, arts administration, community engagement, and student leadership, she specializes in supporting students to realize their creative potential. And you can find Evelyn's writing and trainings at creativityincontext.org. I'll share that link in just a moment after introductions. I'll put that in the chat. And Pam Rich is an organization development consultant who furthers the organizational mission, builds teamwork, and supports strategic thinking for any and all groups on the UC Berkeley campus. Her customized collaborative approach incorporates employee knowledge to identify and implement actionable strategies for creating an efficient and effective workplace. Pam specializes in strategic planning, team development, cross-functional collaboration, retreats, and meeting facilitation. And Pam is also my teammate on our pod team. So she's an awesome teammate and facilitator, as is Evelyn. And Evelyn and Pam, welcome and thank you both for sharing your time and knowledge with us today in this Now Encore series format.
Thanks, Lisa.
Awesome. It's great to get a formal introduction. I should say my job has changed. I forgot to update my resume, but it's all good. Welcome everyone. Excited to see so many folks. Pam and I are here on behalf of the Berkeley Facilitators Network, and so launching off our fall season with this workshop. And this is a new workshop in which we're kind of combining my expertise with Pam's. So my background is in creativity, teaching creativity, the psychology and human development of creative development and across fields. And so I'll be getting to share some research, scientific research behind the creative process as we apply it to facilitation. Pam, do you want to say anything else?
No, I think I also am pleased to have a formal introduction. I don't usually get that. And yeah, I think I'm ready to just get started.
Okay. So what are we doing today? So this workshop goes till I think 12:45, thank you. And we're going to be providing a lot of different information on kind of how to think about team decision making from a creative standpoint. We're going to start with really framing the issue. Why is it difficult to make decisions in teams? And then we'll be moving into kind of, okay, now that we understand the issue, what is it that we want to do? What is it? Why do we want to make decisions in teams? What is the goal for that decision-making process? And then once we have both of those established, we'll reframe the decision-making process from a creative perspective. And how can we apply the kind of science or methodology of the creative process to help us with our facilitation. So we're going to be combining both of those so that you can apply it within your own teams to help make decisions. So that's our plan today. We're going to have some chat, discussion, and some reflection interwoven throughout information. So I'll hand it off to Pam.
Yeah, so we wanted to begin today just with some of your own thinking about what makes it difficult to make decisions in teams. And I want you to take a moment to think about that question and then put some of your thoughts into the chat, maybe experiences that you've had trying to come to decisions in teams, or anything specific you can name about the process that you went through.
Mm-hmm.
Power differentials, hierarchies, working styles. Oh, people are coming fast and furious. Insufficient trust, that's a big one. Finding solutions that does make sense to everyone so that everyone feels heard. Individual motives, different goals. Boy, yes. I don't know if you're having time to catch all of these as they're going through these, all of these things: consensus, white fragility, context, psychological safety, trust.
So a lot of themes around like bringing differences together in a collective decision-making process.
Yeah, all of those.
Mm-hmm.
So some of the things that I have noticed in my experience in, I moved on to the next slide. Thanks, Evelyn. So one of the things that I've noticed is sometimes we have trouble knowing what we're solving for, and we just start solving for something before we've actually identified what we're talking about. Another thing that sometimes happens is we don't have any specific or defined process on how we're making the decision. Is it going to be consensus? Is it going to be majority? And that can create problems. There can also be difficulty in understanding when the discussion phase is over and we're moving into the more kind of actionable item of we're making this decision and then we're going forward from there. And there can also be a lack of patience going through the process, that moving from the divergent thinking of the brainstorming and so on into the convergent thinking, where a decision gets made, can be kind of fraught. Not to mention all of the things that you also mentioned in terms of work styles, lack of trust or psychological safety. Maybe the team doesn't really have norms in terms of how they work together, either because they've worked together for a long time or because they haven't. You want to move on to the next one, Evelyn?
Yeah, so those were challenges that came directly from Pam's experience. And I wanted to speak to also some research as to kind of why collaboration can be difficult. And mostly it's, while the ideal is for everyone to share their perspective and for information to be aggregated to make, the best collective decision, in reality, groups really live up to this potential because, just difficulty in communication and peer pressure that can come from, many different reasons that you've just named in chat. And so I'm going to name a few common pitfalls that have come out of research into the kind of decision making and group think. What causes that? Oh, yes. Okay. So one is that groups can amplify errors in judgment, or amplify biases in errors in judgment. So an error is kind of like a common mental shortcut or bias that leads kind of individuals astray. So an example that that maybe you haven't heard of but you've experienced is called the planning fallacy, where you underestimate how much time a project will take and how much money it will cost. And so this results in, considering only quick and simple fixes because we're operating on that error. Another is called the availability error, which leads us to kind of seize on whatever springs most readily to mind, like the first thought or the first idea or the best, not the best, but the most vivid idea. And then, of course, there's representation or representativeness. And that, in this case, you can think of leads us to believe that things, events, or people that are similar in one way are similar in others, rather than digging deeply and understanding the complexity of the issue we're trying to address. And so how does amplification happen? It's just that since errors are common, we tend to see them as true. And so if most members of the group make that error, others may make them as well in order to avoid seeming foolish or disagreeable. And of course, there are other kinds of biases and errors that show up around kind of societal norms and more around kind of racism and sexism, etc. And so it can be hard to speak up to those in a space. But the good news is that more diverse perspectives can mitigate these errors, but we also have to be able to hear those voices. And so that leads to kind of the next pitfall, which is that groups follow the statements and actions of those who spoke or acted first. Our human brain is really wired from birth to synchronize and imitate other people. So that creates kind of what's called a cascade effect. A small trickle in one direction becomes a flood. And so different kinds of cascades can be like what's called a reputational cascade. People silence themselves to avoid criticism from others, or fear based on societal pressures like patriarchy or racism or hierarchy, or fear of saying the wrong thing. And so that can impact who speaks in the room. There's also, I've mentioned again, this kind of availability error is like we tend to get attached to a vivid idea. It's almost kind of like a viral idea, is like someone says something with passion and then it kind of cascades or amplifies from there. And it can produce a widespread belief within the group that this is the best idea. There is also a lot of research that shows that groups do take up positions that are more extreme before deliberation because of the previous 2 points. The discussion within groups can lead to kind of reinforcing existing beliefs. So like if a group starts off more risk averse versus more cautious, they tend to agree with each other, and that kind of amplifies their belief. We also tend to simplify the diversity of opinions. So a range of opinions before a meeting can end up in 2 camps just because of the kind of like difficulty of being able to discuss multiple perspectives, and due to reputational pressures, like you end up, siding with somebody rather than speaking your specific perspective. And it's also true that when people lack confidence, they tend to be more moderate. So they tend to be not as like overconfident, versus people who are overconfident tend to be more extreme in their beliefs. And so all of these kinds of dynamics can create more of a binary than is actually true for people. And lastly, I really want to focus on this one is groups tend to focus on what everybody knows already, and they miss critical information that people already have. So this is called the common knowledge effect, which is basically the information held by all group members has more influence on group judgments than information held by a few. And what this results in is a term within creativity studies called the hidden profile, It's like somebody who has really important information but doesn't end up sharing it. And there was a study that where they looked at a hiring review committee, and they gave different information to different people in the hiring committee. And they found that the winning candidates tended to be those about whom all the test subjects were given positive information, while the negative information about the winner, about the winner, or positive information about the losers, revealed to only one or two people, did not reach the whole group. So like, even though there was very important negative information to inform the hiring within this test subject, it wasn't expressed. So it was only the shared information that got shared. And so that's like, how do we make sure that the perspectives that are going to inform our decisions are being shared? So these are kind of some common pitfalls that we're gonna kind of, now that we've framed kind of the issue, think about, okay, now what is the goal? And then what is the process? So I'll pass it back to Pam.
Thanks. All right. So given all those difficulties and how challenging it can be to make decisions in a team, why would we want to do it? And I want you to also go into your experience and put in the chat some of the benefits that you've experienced from making decisions in a team, and what can happen when this process is done well. So it helps you get buy-in, yeah, to move forward in a project. And sometimes it's that move slow to go fast kind of mentality. It can take longer to get that buy-in, but once you have it, you can move forward. Open space for creative solutions. That's what we're all here about today. Diversity of thought. It builds trust, creativity, feedback, better communication, strengthens the team in general. Everyone hears the reasoning all at once on the way, so that it's understood how a decision gets made. Thank you, Annette, for agreeing with all of that. Yeah, okay. Thank you for those thoughts. That has been my experience as well. And Evelyn's going to talk a little bit more about some of the research. Thank you all for your responses.
Yeah, and I also want to highlight that we may get into it, but that research on creativity also shows that the best solutions come from collaboration. And so it's, while individual processes is important for kind of deep dives, the actual best ideas come from exchange. And so that's another reason to make decisions in teams. So to frame the goal, I thought we'd talk about flow state. And so some of you may have heard of a flow state. Hopefully you've had the pleasure of experiencing it, but essentially it's a heightened state of creativity. And it can feel like, a high degree of concentration on the task, a loss of self-consciousness, a distorted sense of time, where it's like time flew by as you're working on this. And that relates to a sense of personal control or self-efficacy, really engaged in the creative process and feeling like you're able to problem solve. And that creates this a sense that this is intrinsically rewarding. It's not about the extrinsic reward of getting it done for some reason, but that you're enjoying the process itself. And so I wonder, maybe drop in chat if you've experienced this before, and maybe what activity, maybe it was writing or singing or playing a guitar, or something I was using the arts as examples, but could also be in a conversation with a friend.
Or sports.
Or sports, that's a good one, thank you. It does happen a lot in sports. And you can think of it also as another way to think of it as a balance of skill and challenge. And so I really like this diagram that kind of parses that out. So, like high challenge, low skill would show up as anxiety, like you're not able to meet that challenge. Versus low challenge and low skill is kind of like, what's the point? I'm not able to do anything about this. And then high skill, low challenge is relaxation, where you're kind of like, well, this, I can do this. It's not really challenging me. And so the goal here is to find that middle ground between the challenge and the skill set. I love, I see windsurfing lessons in the chat.
What other things? I'm curious.
Yeah.
Where you get the flow state. Sometimes it's at work if you're into something that you're doing.
Yeah, I say my that happens to me like curriculum design, where I'm like coming up with how to facilitate something, and then I'm like, oh, time went by. Boxing, wrestling, ooh, theater, dance, cooking, that's a good one. Wordle. I love it. All right, so it sounds like many of us know this feeling. And so wouldn't it be nice to experience that in a group? And there actually is research on group flow. And I think, it's the same idea. How do we balance both the challenge and the skill level to be able to meet that, to be able to kind of find that flow within a group? And so we're going to share some conditions for group flow. So this is from a creativity researcher, Keith Sawyer. He's done a lot of research, particularly looking at improv and jazz, of like, what are the conditions that lead to group flow? So what is needed to make group flow possible? And so I'll go through each of these quickly, but basically, some of these sound obvious, but it takes effort to make them happen. So first, just a compelling and clear collective goal. Like, are we all on the same page? And I pulled a quote from Keith that said, in group flow, the group is focused on the natural progress emerging from their work, not on meeting a deadline set by management. Flow is more likely to occur when attention is centered on the tasks and other things are put out of mind. So having a very clear kind of, what is it we're going to achieve in this time together, and focus on the process together, so that it develops that sense of intrinsic motivation, rather than having to solve all these other things as well. And then close listening. I think many of us have, had conversations about active listening. And the idea here is to not go in with preconceived ideas, but to actually respond based on what comes up in the room. And so, innovation, the quote here is blocked when one or more participants already has a preconceived idea of how to get to the goal. And so how can we really be involved in the process? If you think of like an improv team, you're like responding based on what comes up. Complete concentration. I know many of you might be like, well, what is that? But the idea is that we have to set boundaries around times in which we want to come up with a group decision. And so, again, quoting, group flow is more likely when a group can draw a boundary, however temporary or virtual, between the group's activity and everything else. So it's like, okay, we're just focusing on this clear goal. Being in control, another thing that's hard to make happen, but this really has more to do with management around, allowing autonomy within that conversation. So I think often this is around like, either the manager is not in the room. Well, it's called silence the leader. It's a tactic, while the conversation is happening, or they're really a part of it. They're not assessing it. Now, of course, that's hard to do with power dynamics, but how can the leader really help support this idea that people's creative ideas in this space are useful, and therefore they have a more sense of autonomy? Blending egos is another big piece, I think showed up a lot in some of your questions or some of your comments on what makes this difficult. And that's around like, not thinking about whose idea came up with what. Like the research shows that the best ideas, often no one can like identify who came up with it. It came out of a conversation. And so that being like a group goal rather than an individual goal. And then equal participation, that's something that we always want to have, but it also is about kind of like the composition of the team. Like, are people actually able to have competent or complementary skill sets? Are we all kind of like, is there someone who's like, this is brand new to me, I'm not able to jump in, you know? And so like, who is in the room also matters when we think about equal participation, so that people are actually able to get that flow going. And then familiarity, like, if this is the first time you're meeting, you're not going to reach flow. Like, it takes a while to develop kind of like a communication style with people. And so like investing in familiarity is also an important part of this. And then constant communication means like, while we set aside this like specific time to get into group flow, like that the conversation is allowed to continue beyond that, and that a lot of these kind of ideas come from like more like spontaneous conversations in the hallway. And so like being allowed to like have avenues to continue conversation. And then keep it moving is like, it's like the brainstorming rule of not having, not digging too deep and like analyzing and criticizing, but to yes and that allows for more getting into flow. And then lastly, potential for failure. And I would just like to read this quote from Keith Sawyer, and it says, "There's no creativity without failure, and there's no group flow without the risk of failure. The key is to treat every activity as an opportunity to rehearse for the next time." And so rather than having such high stakes for every meeting, how can we always think of this as a rehearsal? And so these are best practices. I am very aware that they are hard to implement. And so what we're going to do for the rest of the workshop is talk through strategies that can support these conditions, but know that this is a practice, that it takes time to kind of develop the conditions to reach group flow. So, so now, and I apologize, I haven't been able to pay attention to chat. Thank you, Pam, for being aware of that. I see there's some conversation happening there. But now we're going to move into kind of, okay, reframing. What does it mean to see things from a creative process? And so I'm wondering, you know, before we kind of define creativity, what comes up for you when we combine the words facilitation and creativity or creative process? Like, what, how does that resonate with you, or what are combining those two words? What does that bring to mind? So facilitation and creativity or creative process. Magic, I love it. Flow of people and ideas, yeah. Visual, sticky notes, yes. Often we're talking like brainstorming with sticky notes. Open-ended questions. Expanding what's possible. That's a language I use a lot. And so that can be expanding what's possible both in our terms of ideas, but like how we work together as well. Thought partnership. So that's also like a great outcome if we can reach group flow. Having more interaction. Structure that allows for openness and flexibility. Nice. Skills. Requires skills to do both. So both the skills to the creativity as a skill and the facilitation as a skill. Multiple modalities.
I love that, Amy.
Yeah, joy. Oh, well, let's hold on to that joy, because I know the first part of this was like, oh, this is hard. And so like, how can we bring a little joy into this process in our facilitation so that it feels a little less hard? And that will also influence the team decision making as well, how we approach it. So yeah, keep things going. I'm going to move into kind of defining creativity based on kind of research, but actually I'm going to ask another question for chat. I'm curious if you're willing to name, you know, do you think of yourself as creative? Yes, no, maybe some other caveat. I'm just, you know, gut instinct. What are we thinking? Do you think of yourself as creative? All right, see some yeses, a lot of some big no's. I think the people who say no feel it strongly. We got
some environments.
What did you say, Pam?
In some environments.
In some environments, so it's contextual. Yeah. Yeah, it does. I feel you, Amy, on like claiming the artist thing. I have studied creativity all my life, but I have a struggle calling myself an artist. So there is, but we'll soon learn creativity does not mean just artist. It's much broader. Nice. I love it. So I love some people are claiming it. Some people are feeling like, I don't know, somewhat medium. And some people are like, ooh, that is an uncomfortable zone for me. So I'll be curious to see, like, once we define it, if this shifts anything for anyone. But I'm going to start off with a cognitive decision or definition, which is kind of just like what's happening, the mental process of creativity. And this is a definition that I've pulled from many sources. And so it's my definition, but it's kind of generally from many sources. And so it's creativity is a new combination of thought that is determined to have value, use, or meaning. So that is like different than having artistic skill. It is just every time you have a, oh, what if I did this moment? And that can be both have individual value. So having value, so meaning can be for you individually. Maybe it's a new outfit that you decided in the morning, or a different route to work, or, you know, put a new spice in your cooking. Or it can be for a group, determined to have value, use, or meaning for others, in which case that's more of an assessment process through expressing your creativity to others. But it really is, it's a kind of a just combination of new thoughts that you get to apply. And so this is where my favorite definition, more of an applied definition, comes in that I find very accessible. And this is from an arts therapist named Sean McNiff. And he defines it as creativity is the ability to take what exists and change it into something new through unique, responsive acts. It puts imagination into action. So my shorthand definition for creativity is imagination in action. So imagination is that those thoughts, those combinations of thoughts. And so you can have an idea, but it's really not until you put it to action that you're expressing your creativity. So until you try out that recipe or that route to work. And so what this means is that also that creativity is inherently relational and responsive. It's always responding to the context you're in. So it's not about having the best and most original thought. It's about that close listening, that responding to what are the needs of the moment. And so for facilitation, it's the same thing. And so I want to like basically say like facilitation is a creative process. All of you in this definition are creative. And so really for facilitation, it's more about like developing your toolkit so that you have the right response to each moment. And also hopefully thinking of facilitation as a creative process opens you up to experimentation. And trusting the process, like learning from each moment. How can I respond to what's needed right now? And I see a question a little bit about innovation. Yeah, I mean, I think innovation is more that values or meaning for larger groups of people. So there's creativity can be broken down into different kind of context. The individual creativity is more small c creativity. It's literally defined as that. And then big C is values or meaning for a group of folks. And so innovation is like, is it innovative within this field? Has this field determined that it has value, use, or meaning? So given that definition, I hope, you know, like you can start to notice all the ways that you are creative in your everyday life. And then we're going to talk specifically about the creative process, kind of a step-by-step process that, you know, this is not linear. It's just one way to define it, but then we're going to break it down into facilitation skills that you can apply within team decision making. So this also comes from Keith Sawyer. He wrote a textbook called Explaining Creativity, the Science of Human Innovation. And this is an adapted version. And as I said, it's not linear. It's usually happening in kind of multiple cycles, but I'm going to talk through what these steps are through a couple examples of more kind of artistic practice, and then we'll apply it to facilitation. So first is define the problem. Like, we often talk about creative problem solving, but first we have to define what it is we want to solve. And so, for instance, in design, that's a whole big process, like around, okay, what is the issue? You know, like, so doing those focus group interviews, talking to people, what is it that we actually, what do we need to solve? In painting, that looks like, okay, what do I want to paint? Is this a, you know, am I doing a plein air, like outdoor painting? Is this a still life inside? You know, like, or do I have a idea I want to express through my painting? And so defining kind of like, what is it that you want to express, or what is it that you want to solve? And then learn the skills is like, okay, now that you know what you want to solve, like, do you have the skills to meet that problem or to solve that problem? So for design, maybe you need to develop more coding skills, or, you know, learn how to use a 3D printer. For painting, maybe you're like, oh, you know, this subject really requires watercolor and I haven't used that before. So this is something to also be thinking about, like, in your own process. It's like, not necessarily, I don't have the skills to meet the problem, but how do I develop the skills that are needed for this issue? And gathering related information is around kind of, okay, now that we have the problem and the skills, like, what do I need to know to address this? So for design, that's like, what's been used before? What has been the experiences of similar products or competitors? For painting, it's similar, like, who's painted the subject before? What, you know, I don't, like, how can I be inspired but not copy them? You know, what information do I need to capture this moment? And then to take a break. And so taking a break should be throughout this. I want to highlight it because a lot of your best ideas, when those new combinations of thought come, is when you're not actively trying to be creative. So that's that shower thought or that moment of inspiration when you're on a walk. And it's because when we're really hyper focused, our brain literally, like, it isn't able to access the rest of our ideas or the rest of our thoughts. It's like focused in one area. And so it's like, once we take a break, all of a sudden there's new possibilities of combinations. And so that's always important in any creative process. And then coming up with as many ideas as possible. This is the divergent thinking phase. And a lot of us skip this. We kind of go straight towards what we think is the best idea rather than exploring possibilities. And so for design, you know, that's iterating a bunch of ideas, presenting different possibilities. For painting, it's sketching a bunch of small sketches to see, like, what's the right composition. And then moving from divergent to convergent thinking, okay, how do we determine what the best idea is by identifying the themes and possibilities. Okay, these ideas solve this part of the problem and this one solves this. Can we combine them in some way? With painting, I'm like, okay, I kind of like this composition, but I like this color. And so figuring out what kind of how, like, categorizing and figuring out what you want to bring together. And then finally, all of this leads to making the decision. So I want to recognize all of these steps, all of this work that goes into making the best decision. And that informs what decision is the best, like what is the criteria that you need to know. And once you've decided, okay, we're gonna move forward with this prototype, or I'm gonna paint this composition with this painting, then that's finally when you put it to action. That's when you start painting, when you start building. And again, then you're learning from that experience, because an idea in your mind is very different once you start doing it. So then you might go through these process again as you're trying to implement it. So those are some examples from an artistic or design perspective. Now we're going to apply it to facilitation. And I know I've talked a lot. I think this is my last slide before I hand it back to Pam. And so we're going to try to frame each of these steps as a little bit kind of best practices, what's to think about, and then provide you a strategy as a facilitator. So this first step, defining the problem, I just want to, reiterate and kind of expand on this idea of, we often think about creative problem solving, which is determining how the issue will be decided. We think like there's a pre-existing problem that we have to figure out how to solve, but an entire other part of the creative process is determining what needs to be decided. And so that's an incredibly important part of a facilitator's job, is figuring out kind of like, what is the goal of this meeting? What is the decision point? And so I'm going to hand it off to Pam to think about, to offer some strategies around that.
Thanks, Evelyn. I sort of love this because as you were talking, I was like, my mind was all kind of going. I've been thinking a lot about the notion of learning organizations and how you sort of raise the general capacity of your team to be doing better at these things that we're describing. And in a sense, the steps that you're describing, I think, are really useful in that process. And it helps then, like, if we're defining the problem, there may be something specific that we're going for, but in the way that we do it, it may also raise up the sort of the capacity of the team for problem solving or whatever. So in that sense, David, I saw your comment about like, just facilitating a staff meeting or something. And so there may be kind of some underlying thing that you'd also like your team to be doing, even if it's just what's the progress on the project we're working on so far. Let's see. So in terms of defining the problem, what I wanted to note was that this is a real step. It's not optional. Like, we really need to make sure that we are all talking about the same thing and that we are on the same page with what we're trying to work around. And then it's useful to think about the process that we want to use before we have the conversation. So that may be around how the decision gets made. It may be we need to make a decision today. This isn't for a decision, it's just to have the discussion. So it's important to be clear about sort of where you are in the process as well. Let's see. The next skill is about learning the skills. And some of the best practices that I was thinking about is trying to practice in low stakes environments. It can be scary to try out stuff for the first time. So maybe you start facilitating a meeting in your own team rather than doing it in front of 100 people or whatever. Pushing your comfort zone, and that's maybe moving in that flow state to the place of a little bit of anxiety, not into the terror state, because then you just tend to freeze up, but just sort of pushing yourself out into the space where maybe you're a little uncomfortable, so that you're still able to take in some learning. Embracing mistakes. And we talk about that a lot at Berkeley, and it's not always the safest place to do that. I think we are working on making mistakes be okay. And in some places they're more okay than in others. But seeing if we can both embrace them for ourselves and give some grace to others when they make them, and trying to shift our culture around that of mistakes as part of learning. I found it really useful to learn from others. I learn a lot from watching other people. YouTube can be a great tool, and finding safe spaces to practice.
And I might as well, this is a good moment to plug the Berkeley Facilitators Network. If Lisa or Pam, if you want to drop our staff page in chat, we're going to be focusing this semester on building community and having kind of conversation for these, how to apply these skills within your teams and work. And so this is a great way to follow up on that.
Thanks, Evelyn. If you could move to the next slide. I've also promoted the Berkeley Facilitators Network. It can be a great place to practice. We invite any of you to come in and say, hey, I want to practice this tool, or I want to practice with this session, and you can either do it on your own or we can support you. So that's a way of practicing and then having an opportunity to reflect. And because the BFN is supposed to be a learning space, we can come in very transparently and say, I've never done this before, but I want to try this out. And I think we'll be a supportive group. Take a training. The people and organization development team have a gazillion trainings that are pretty amazing. And some of you may be familiar with a group called Community at Work. And they are the group from which Berkeley Facilitator Network sprung, and they offer a really amazing class in participatory decision-making and facilitation. LinkedIn Learning has ideas, and in an Achieve Together conversation, you might talk to your supervisor about skills that you'd like to be learning and discuss with them where there might be some low stakes environment where you can try that out. And as I mentioned earlier, observing others. Next slide. Yes. So gathering related information, some best practices, having some awareness about what you need to know. And sometimes that can be hard. Like, I'm not even sure what I need to know in order to come with more information to make this decision. Sometimes data can be really useful. And I find that it's useful to get a variety of sources and information types and information from different people, particularly diverse groups. Being certain that your information comes from reliable sources.
Can I grab you?
And staying open to what, is that a question coming in? Okay. Staying open to what you're hearing and learning. I have ice cream story in my slides because I recently read a story in the Atlantic about a group of researchers who were studying nutrition, and they kept coming up with ice cream being healthy for people. And the more senior researchers were like, no, that must be wrong. Go back and do it again. And these experiments were done over and over again. And it turned out that eating ice cream, the folks that ate the ice cream had higher levels of something that was good for you. I am not a detailed person, so of course I don't remember what it was, but I thought, oh yeah, that sort of went against what we think about ice cream being fatty and fattening and so on. Higher levels of joy things, and I would agree. Next slide. So I sat on a board at one point, and the board chair used to say, what else do you need to know in order to make your decision? And I used to think like, oh, I made my decision 20 minutes ago. I just was curious to have more information. So sometimes you've got enough information to move ahead. Is there more information? Assign a person or a committee to do the additional research that might be required in order to make the decision. And subject matter experts, or SMEs, are often a great source of information. All right, taking a break. This was something, I'll go through this and then I'll tell my own story. Taking a break to digest what you've learned. And this, as Evelyn pointed out earlier, is something that's useful to do kind of throughout the process. Reflect on what you've learned, using those breaks strategically, I often have thought about taking a break as procrastinating, and then realized how actually very productive that time was in terms of coming up with ideas as my brain was resting. And engaging your brain in a different way, I find that if I'm drawing or coloring or doing sports or somehow like getting my head into a different space, it's also really useful for allowing more creative ideas to emerge. And onward, Evelyn. Ways to do this, there are many. Journaling, just taking a day or two. And I know I used to for papers that I had to write, would finish it and then just go away for a day. And often that would make me think like, oh, that paragraph doesn't make any sense, or I need this in order to make it flow more easily, or something like that. I'm a crossword puzzle addict. So sometimes if I come back in a day, it's much easier. I have no idea why, but something changes in my brain. Walking with a colleague is also really great because it engages both sides of your brain. Because you're walking, you're engaging, gosh, is that the right side of the brain? So that can be useful in sort of encouraging new ideas for when you're thought partnering or just thinking out loud. We in the Berkeley, and let's see, what did we call it? The anti-racism facilitation series, we talked about something called the equity pause. And that was if there was something charged in a conversation, and in this case, we were talking about issues of inequity, but it can be for anything. I'm just saying, I need to step out for a minute and think about that. Yeah, and as I was stepping into the shower a couple days ago, I was telling Evelyn that I hadn't really been thinking about like decision making really as a decision making as a creative process. And then I was like, oh, this workshop is really all about the creative process. And all of these steps really are creative. And if you kind of put your mindset to there is no set outcome, let's see what emerges from this. Even just sort of shifting to thinking of this as a creative process, I think helps our brain move into that space more easily. Onward.
Yeah, I think the next slide's mine, but I want to highlight that like instead of it being around making the right choice as a facilitator, you're like, well, okay, if I think of it as creative, the moment's seeming like it's needing this tool. Let me try it out. And then, oh, okay, this worked. Let me go with that. Oh no, there's pushback. Okay, what's the next tool I have? So it's not about this pressure of you have to do everything perfectly. It's about being responsive to the moment. How responsive can you be? And I also wanted to highlight the use a break to shift energy. That was something that came up in previous trainings around like, you don't have to keep pushing forward if the meeting's out of place that it's not going to get resolved. It's kind of like, let's take a break. Everyone needs a break. And so using that as a tool within your facilitation. So moving on to kind of like, okay, these are the steps to set up for the meeting, and now like we're getting into that decision process and like how to support that. So thinking of coming up with many ideas. And so I mentioned earlier that like we tend to skip over divergent thinking. So I just wanted to kind of re-highlight what that process is so that we make sure to make space for it. And so divergent thinking is like the thought process or method to use to generate creative ideas by exploring as many possible solutions, or just many possible solutions. So it's about creating choice. And then convergent thinking is when we actually make choices. And so It's involves bringing together different ideas to determine the single best solution to a well-defined problem. So that's stepping back to defining the problem before we even come up with ideas. And so, like, how do we make sure that we're separating these things so that there's space for that divergent thinking before we get to picking the best solution? And this also helps bring out more voices. And so, that said, brainstorming is actually, there's a lot of research that shows that it doesn't work all that well because of all the things we talked about. There's, some people take up a lot of space, or the people who are most confident, or we go with the most vivid idea, or we get into criticism. And so suggest that you use brain writing instead. There's been research that shows that when we do collaborative writing, a lot more ideas are generated and more voices are heard. And so this can look like when it's in person, you'll have a piece of paper and each person writes down 3 ideas based on a well-defined problem. I think the one, sorry, it's really small on my screen, but you can see an example here. No, I can't read it, it's too small. Sorry, I have a smaller screen for the presenter notes. So, but the example of kind of like, how do we want to address this topic? And then 3 ideas, and then you pass the next person, and they can either add on like to the idea, like, oh, what about this? Here's a different idea, or they can ask a question, or they can iterate on the idea. Like, a lot of what happens, how we generate more ideas is not by coming up with a ton of original, but like small iterations, so like we'll do a community event, but add food. We'll do a community event at a basketball field, or court, like, and that's how we start to kind of build out the world of our idea. You can also do this online through Google Docs or some collaborative writing thing. So, set up a table and like a literal table of not table of contents, like table with columns and rows, and have people start writing together. And what that allows, it also helps people who are a little bit more shy to express their ideas. And so this is a one tool you can use to support the divergent thinking process. I'll hand it back to Pam for identifying themes and possibilities.
Yeah, I think we've talked about this as it being important to hear everyone's voice. And there's a saying, and I always get it wrong, but it's something like we buy into what we build. And there are lots of techniques for participatory decision making. We go over a number of those in the Berkeley Facilitators Network, the Sam Kainer Community at Work facilitation training also provides a lot of tools for that. And I think I'm mostly focusing on the process that I use in this particular case. Yeah, one methodology that I use is that I think somebody mentioned Post-it notes before, but using Post-it notes to create kind of a mind map for folks of putting all of your ideas on Post-it notes, one idea per Post-it, and then as a team, taking those Post-its and clustering them by themes, so that we might have one on communication, or maybe it's watercolor technique, or whatever the creative process is that we're working on, and then move those around until you've got things in an agreed upon set of I call them buckets or clusters. And then you take a look at the specific cluster and say, like, what is this bucket that we've all agreed those things all belong together? And you give it a name, and that can be a way of sort of clustering, theming, whatever some of the larger things that we're talking about. And from there you can break them down smaller, or it sort of makes the process a little more manageable feeling.
Yeah, and I'll add that like this clustering process allows you to see, which of these ideas best address the stated goal. And so like you can be like, okay, well this cluster helps with engaging this community. Well, this cluster helps with maybe engaging youth. And so what are the best ideas for each of these clusters, and can we combine them? And so that's just an example of like how this helps in the process of converging ideas.
Thank you. And I see in the chat that somebody mentioned Miro as a tool. There are a number of online tools for this process. I just saw that Google came out with one recently. Mural is one that I've used, and even Jamboard, which is part of the Google Apps thing, can be useful. Okay, so when it comes time to actually making the decision, all of these steps that you've done so far have been really useful in that process. And what you want to do is, based on the choices you made at the beginning of the process, name when the discussion phase is over and remind folks about what you said would be the process for making the decision. Are we dot voting, and that will be good enough? Do we need consensus? Are we actually really just providing the leader with recommendations, and then they will make the decision after that? Those kinds of conversations are really important, and that process is really important to know from the get-go, because if you as a team are spending a long time on a decision-making process, you provide that information back to a leader and they make a decision that's completely different, and you didn't know that you didn't have the actual say-so on that decision, it's demoralizing and you won't want to participate in that process again. So having the whole, like, how this is all unfolding is really, really important. And one of my favorite tools, which some of you I'm sure have seen me use before, is something called the gradients of agreement. And in the gradients of agreement, you create an actual proposal based on the decision that you've maybe come up with, of like, this seems to be where we're weighing in on this. And in order to get kind of a pulse of what everybody in the room thinks, you give them this gradients of agreement. Maybe it's a chart, maybe it's something on a Zoom meeting, and you can even do a fist to 5 if you wanted to, which is, this is a 0 and this is a 5, and then there are various places in between. And if you weigh in at a 1, it means, I hate this proposal, I think we need to start over. 2 would mean, I support this proposal, but I think it's going to need a lot of change. 3 is, I'm almost there, but I think we need some minor changes. And 4 is, I support this proposal, and I'm a big proponent of the good enough idea. Can I live with this? Will it be fine? Sure, I can go along with it. I was talking about a mission statement recently with somebody, and he was like, yeah, I'm a 3. But if you added the word experiment in there, I'd be a 4. And I thought, oh, that's pretty easy. You add one word, and often somebody brings that up as their 3 issue when you talk about that with the group, and they're like, oh yeah, that's better. So in this process, I find that you usually kind of come in on something that's a little better than what you had. And you also see, where are we in this process? If you've got a lot of 1s and 2s, you probably have some more work to do. If you've got mostly 3s and 4s, you're either there or almost there. And depending on how how much buy-in is required for this decision will probably make you think about how well do we need to be doing on these gradients of agreement in order to move on. I am not going to go over all of these tips, but they will be part of the slide deck that you can take a look at afterwards. And I think we'll just move on. Yeah, and then finally put that decision into action and create an action plan. Much of that process looks very similar to what we just went through. What's our desired outcome? That might be similar to what's the problem. Outlining the steps or anticipated steps that we think might happen. And again, this is sort of an iterative and sort of experimental process of like, we think this is what's going to happen, but I want the right to reserve maybe changing it down the line. Who's going to be responsible for doing this work? There's something called a RACI model. You can Google it, that helps divide up how that sort of chain of command for who's responsible for the work might roll out. Are there people who need to be involved or informed in that process? What might be your measures of success? If we have this desired outcome, how will we know for sure that we've reached it? And often you want something somewhat concrete to say, yes, we've reached our increase scores by 5% or add 100 people to the mailing list or whatever it is, but something concrete that you can measure is usually helpful. You can't always measure it exactly, but figure out how you might be able to do that. Set a date when you want to be done, and then create times for checking in and reviewing the progress. As I said, it can be an iterative process. So you might find out in step 2, oh my God, that's not really the process we needed to use. Let's review that and think through that again. And there's a general table that you might use to support you in your planning process. And I don't think I need to go over that again.
Oh, okay. I think this is me stepping in.
You?
I think we are getting to the last 5 minutes, so we want to hold a little space, but we wanted to offer this takeaway as a reflection. So, a lot of this is just requires intentionality and practice. Often we're moving quickly and don't necessarily step back and kind of examine our process. And so that's where the potential for a different creative response comes in. And so your takeaway is to identify one area that you want to creatively grow in and how you want to put it to practice. So is it on determining the problem to solve? Is it developing your skills? Is it coming up with more ideas, supporting that, figuring out how to make the best ideas through convergent thinking and identifying possibilities, remembering to take a break, helping facilitate the decision-making process through things like the gradients agreement, or making sure that there's follow through in assessing the decision afterwards. Like what tool can you bring? It doesn't have to be all of the above. Pick one and try it out. And I know we need to hand it off to Lisa. I want to.
Do we have a minute for questions or not really?
Okay, Lisa's
Sure,
taking it.
we go till 12:45, so we have 4 minutes.
So we'll definitely be sharing, I saw the question, we'll be sharing the slide deck. Lisa will be, I want to drop in chat our staff page, so that, because we're going to be holding circles of practice to have conversations about these things. So there's room for follow-up there too. I think it's ideal team size for this kind of work is a question. And Pam, I know ideal team size kind of relates to thinking about like what process is appropriate. Like if you have a large group, you're not going to reach a consensus or unanimous consensus, for instance.
Right. And that post-it note activity that I mentioned, I have done it with as many as 10. It can start to get chaotic if you've got 10 people on a whiteboard moving post-its around. So that's a great question about how many people in a facilitation. And I think as you become sort of more comfortable in those meetings, you can try out different tools and you start learning different tools. And you can ask folks, like, what would be a way of getting to this outcome, and what might be an interesting strategy to use with a group of 10 or a group of 50 or whatever.
I think the question of meeting group flow and size depends on how many of the conditions you're able to meet. So if a smaller group helps meet the conditions of kind of like familiarity, complementary skill sets, able to keep the conversation going, then it's more likely. But it doesn't mean that that's not possible with intentionality to build that over time, So
I would also offer myself as a resource. If anybody wanted to email me and say, hey, I've got a meeting coming up. You have any tips for me? I'm happy to brainstorm with you and think through some of that if that's helpful.
Well, we're in our last minute. Thank you all. Thank you, Lisa, for hosting or co-sponsoring this workshop with us. We hope to see many of you at future BFN events.
And thank you all for your engagement. Even though we did a lot of talking, it felt like you were all with us. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Evelyn and Pam, for taking your time, sharing your knowledge, sharing this really helpful process to help us all be more creative and effective in our teams and facilitations. Thank you all for being here. I did share the link to the evaluation in the chat. I will follow up within the next 40 or 24 hours to share the deck and other resources that were mentioned and the evaluation link if I don't get to it this afternoon after my meetings. And we appreciate everybody's engagement, and we hope you have a great afternoon. And Pam and Evelyn, if you have a few extra minutes, we can stay here to take questions for anybody who wants to, who has the time and wants to stay and ask.
Yeah, I believe I have time. I look at my schedule most of the time, and I closed it off so I wasn't distracted.
All right, I will stop the recording now.